I will be reading from 1 Samuel 25, 1 through 35, as it is paraphrased by the Shine On Study Bible. David stayed far away as long as Saul remained king of Israel. David and his soldiers were hiding in the wilderness near the home of Nabal, a rich but selfish man who owned many goats and sheep. David's soldiers were often made sure that Nabal's shepherds and sheep were safe. One day, Nabal was giving a feast. David sent some of his soldiers to Nabal to say, "Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. We have helped your shepherds. May we share in your food and drink?" Nabal said, "Who is this David? Why should I give bread and meat to people I don't even know?" The soldiers returned and told David what Nabal had said. David was very angry. "We helped him, and now he is insulting us. Strap on your swords," he said. Nabal was married to a woman named Abigail, who was clever and kind. One of Nabal's shepherds quickly went to Abigail. He said, "David and his soldiers were good to us, but our masters shouted insults at them. Now they are coming to fight us." Abigail quickly made a plan. She loaded food onto her donkeys: 5 sheep ready to roast, 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 100 clusters of raisins, 200 fig cakes, and some grain. She sent servants ahead of her with the food. She followed behind on a donkey. When Abigail saw David, she got off her donkey and bowed down to the ground. "Please let me speak to you," she said. "I did not hear your soldiers asking Nabal for food. He has acted selfishly. But please accept this gift of food and do not let your anger turn to fighting." David replied, "Blessed be God and blessed be your good sense. God sent you to me, Abigail. Blessed be God who kept me from hurting you and from being hurt." He accepted Abigail's gifts and said, "Go home in peace. I have heard your words and I will do what you said. I will not fight."
Morning. It's really good to be back. For those of you that haven't noticed, we've been away for 2 weeks. And we were glad to have some time away, some time with family, some time to see the Phillies beat the Royals. Yeah, it was a good time, and we're very, very glad to be back. Glad to have avoided the worst of the heat, it seems, but glad to see all your faces and be present with you again. And glad to be focusing on this particular story. The story of Abigail and David is like Anna said, it's in the Shine On Story Bible, but it's nowhere in any other sort of broad church stories. So the lectionary, in which kind of divides up 4 years worth of scriptures into pieces for each Sunday. Whoever made that back whenever they made that didn't include this story in it. There's a new lectionary, a narrative lectionary, all about stories, and this story wasn't in there. So I'm very grateful to be telling this story, and maybe it's one you've heard before, maybe not. But as with any story, particularly from the Old Testament, it bears a little bit of understanding context and looking at kind of what came before. So the reality for the people of Israel was that they were, at this point, they had been rescued from Egypt. They had wandered in the wilderness. They made it into the promised land, sort of the land of Israel, but they were still sort of a tribal group that wasn't very highly organized. Jerusalem, we think of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. They didn't actually have control over Jerusalem at this point. And so as we go through the book, particularly the book of Judges, which is just a little bit before 1 Samuel, we see that Israel was led by a host of different judges that were in charge, and a lot of the ways in which the Judges goes is it talks about how the people didn't follow the ways of God, and so a judge was kind of called up to get them in line, and then they didn't follow God again, and then a judge was called up to kind of get them in line, and then guess what happened? They didn't follow God again, and so a judge was called up. And so throughout this time, the people said, well, what we really need is we need a king like all the other nations. And God, through Samuel, said, hello, I'm your king. Yahweh, God, I am supposed to be your king. The point of me calling you together is you're not actually supposed to be like the rest of the nations. If you were to get a king, guess what's going to happen? They're going to be selfish. They're going to hoard money. They're going to hoard wives. They're going to be violent. They're going to bring the nation to ruin. And the people said, yeah, we want that. We want a king like the rest of the nations. And God, through Samuel, said, okay. So Samuel anoints Saul, and Saul becomes the king of Israel, again, without maybe the formality that we would imagine, because they were still sort of a ragtag band. But he becomes the king of Israel, and guess what happens? He follows God some of the times, and some of the times he kind of goes his own way. He fights his own battles, and he makes some mistakes, and he disobeys God on a number of occasions, and eventually God tells Samuel, you need to kind of take that kingship away from Saul, and I'll give you someone else to anoint. That happens to be David, the boy David, and we maybe know that story of David he's the shepherd who lives in the fields and plays his music, and no one expects that he's going to be very important. He's the youngest of the brothers. But he's anointed as the new king, but it's all happens in this weird thing where Samuel takes away God's blessing to be king, but it's not an official take the crown away where everyone can see it. So everyone kind of still thinks that Saul's the king. And when he goes and anoints David, we still don't actually that doesn't mean David gets a crown. It's sort of a under the radar scenario. So most of the people of Israel still think Saul is king as David grows up. Well, we know, many of us know probably the most famous story of David, which is David killing Goliath. Does that sound familiar to anybody? David's a young boy. The people of Israel are fighting with the Philistines. He comes and he kills. He's actually bringing food to his brothers. He's bringing supplies to his brothers, and it just so happens he gets offended by this Goliath. This little kid is like, how dare that 10-foot man make fun of us, right? And he says, well, I can take care of it. So he goes out with a sling and a stone, and he defeats Goliath, and he becomes very famous. Saul thinks, hey, this kid's got something, right? So Saul makes him in charge of his army. So David becomes Saul's favorite surrogate son, sort of, puts him in charge of a selection of his soldiers, and David ends up leading battles and winning victories. And there comes a moment when the victorious soldiers are coming back to wherever Israel sort of gathered, and the people sing these songs of praise, and they sing, Saul has defeated his thousands, and David has defeated his tens of thousands. Well, this is where the selfish king that God warned about snaps, because he now realizes that David is more popular and eventually and potentially will be more powerful than him. So he tries to kill David on several occasions, and David goes on the run. And David goes on the run, but again, because he's an important military leader, he has soldiers with him. So Saul has soldiers that are loyal to him, that are pursuing David, and David has soldiers that are loyal to him, and they are in a kind of a hunt for David. So this is where we find David. David is on the run. He's kind of in the wilderness, trying to avoid Saul's soldiers as much as possible, when he comes to this land where Abigail and Nabal, or Nabal for short, live. And the story is pretty straightforward, and what's helpful is the story tells us all we need to know right from the beginning. We're introduced to these characters of Nabal and Abigail. Nabal is wealthy, and he's mean, and he's rude. Abigail is wise and beautiful. So David's men have set up camp nearby to Nabal's property, and they've been sort of around as Nabal's men have been shearing the sheep and taking care of the livestock and all these kinds of things. And that's when David sends a message to Nabal because his men are on the run and they don't really have a home base to speak of. And he explained the message to Nabal is, we've been taking care of you guys. We've been watching over you. For weeks, there has been no harm that has come to your men as they've been out on the edge of the wilderness because we've been around and keeping things safe for you all. So we should get a thank you gift. It only makes sense, right? We have been protecting you. We should get a thank you gift. And since we know that Nabal is mean and rude, we kind of can see what's coming. And Nabal refuses and even throws in a little insult saying, well, who's David? Right? And so in David's mind, David's like, well, I'm the anointed one. I'm the one who killed Goliath. Have you ever heard of Goliath, right? So David, in a little bit of his own hubris, is very offended because Nabal says, who is this David anyway? So he prepares his soldiers to destroy Nabal and all his men. He's ready for battle. That's what he's been trained to do and what he's been doing most of his young life. And he's offended because he was refused what was rightfully his and been mocked, sort of. So once this is about to happen, some servants of Nabal's run to tell Abigail what has happened, and she springs into action. She prepares a large gift of food. She takes it directly to David while he's on his way to attack Nabal. David accepts the gift, and the tension is settled. Although Nabal has no idea that any of this has happened. This is entirely between Abigail and David, and Nabal is clueless to what happened. So it's an interesting story. On the one hand, I think it's simple and obvious because the characters are easy to understand. He is rude and foolish. She is wise and beautiful. I think that plays on a stereotype that some of us can imagine, right? It might not take us too long to look for a scenario in which he is mean and rude and she is wise and beautiful. And it kind of plays on tropes that we've seen in pop culture too, right? Like Home Improvement, Tim Taylor and his wife, or The Simpsons, right? Like there's this idea, there's stereotype about men and women that I think plays out that we're familiar with. As much as it is a stereotype and not always true, it's something we're familiar with. So it's easy for us to kind of understand. If we're tracking David's story, we can kind of see that David he's on edge, he's fearful, he's hungry, and he's probably a little full of himself. And so we have this conflict where two powerful men are offended by each other, and the situation devolves into aggression and violence. And she comes in with wisdom and generosity, seeing that everything is headed down the pit towards this senseless violence and bloodshed, all because two prideful, foolish men couldn't see past their own egos. That's like a story we can grasp, right? Like that's a basic story that we can understand, and we can see those pieces. Again, it plays on stereotypes, but that's something that we can at least be familiar with. So it's an easy to grasp story. This is where I go to on the other hand, right? You all know that's coming. On the other hand, it's also a remarkable story because in the context of a biblical narrative that is filled with violence, filled with bloodshed, filled with the perception that fighting wins the day, fighting wins the land and wins God's favor and all that. Here we find a very specific vision of peacemaking, a very specific and powerful story of peacemaking. And in a biblical narrative filled with so many men at the center of the story, here we find a woman hero. Abigail is the very definition of a hero and a peacemaker, intervening, stepping into, putting herself in the way of conflict and harm to bring peace to a situation. She is the one who prevents violence when so many have not been able to. So it's worth a look at this story because it is both easy to understand and it is remarkable. What can we learn from Abigail's wise peacemaking work? Well, most of the time, as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about how a lot of the time we imagine peacemaking work primarily in terms of protecting the weak and the innocent. When we think of doing peace and justice, bringing God's shalom into the world, we are specifically thinking about, oftentimes we were thinking about the weak and the vulnerable because we remember how Jesus talked about taking care of those people. We remember the refrains all through the Old Testament about how Israel was supposed to take care of the poor and the orphan, take care of the widow and the immigrant. And so a lot of our modern framework for imagining peace and justice work is taking care of the poor and the vulnerable. I read a story by Isaac Villegas. He wrote a story. Isaac is a Mennonite pastor in North Carolina, and he wrote this very heartbreaking story about his friend named Joe. Joe had a psychological emergency and was having severe suicidal ideation, severe suicidal thoughts. So Joe was calling some friends to make some sort of connection or find some sort of help. And one of his friends who was intending help called 911. By the time Isaac arrived at Joe's house, the police were putting up crime scene tape. Joe had been shot and killed by a responding officer because he was holding a knife and appeared to be a threat. Since that incident, their local city of Durham, following the example of lots of other cities around the country, created new response teams of unarmed first responders who specialize in mental health and social work. According to Villegas, their goal is to de-escalate social disturbances without the need for law enforcement personnel. Villegas writes how grateful he is that these teams now are in place, that they are able to respond to hundreds of calls every month. And in doing so, they avert violence by wisely intervening and protecting the lives of the vulnerable, particularly those going through social, relational, and mental health crises. He does not want for a situation like Joe's to ever happen again, and he's grateful that things have been put in place, that they now have responders who can respond nonviolently to de-escalate. That's one of the visions that we might have about how we can create peace so that we can protect the vulnerable and the weak and those who struggle. But what's interesting is that if you look at Abigail's story, Abigail is actually more concerned with David, and I would say protecting David, than anything having to do with her husband. She does avert the violence of Nabal and his men getting attacked and totally taken out, his men obviously being the innocents in this story. But Abigail is primarily concerned with David, at least in the language that she uses. When she approaches David, she agrees that her husband, Nabal, is an idiot. She says, "My husband's name is Nabal." Nabal means foolish. I don't disagree with that definition of his name. She takes ownership to, in a sense, to say, I know that he's foolish and he made a mistake. Some translations actually use a harsher term to say that Nabal means villain or villainous. Because sometimes for us, foolish means like, oh, someone that just doesn't know any better. But foolish in Hebrew meant like intentionally making the wrong decisions. So Abigail then tells David that she hopes that he will not shed blood needlessly, nor take his vengeance into his own hands. So if we've been paying attention to the story up until this point, we know that one of the main reasons that Saul was stripped of his title by God and Samuel was because he was taking military battles into his own hands. When God told Saul what battles he should be going into, he said, only these, and this is how you are to do it. And Saul would go in and do his own version of those battles. So when God said to destroy every artifact or item that the other force had, Saul went in and spared all that stuff and started looting and taking all of the livestock and all of the gold and jewels and all that stuff and spreading it out amongst his men. So Saul took his kingship and his authority and took it into his own hands and made decisions that were not in keeping with what God wanted. So we can see that if that was Saul's disobedience and Saul's eventual end was to be stripped of his title, the same thing was on the way for David. If David chose to attack Nabal, it would be purely out of his own hubris. It would have been out of his own selfishness. He would have been right, as Abigail says. He would have been right in the sense that Nabal owed him something, but he wouldn't have been right in the sense that he was going to take on this violence by his own hands. So Abigail potentially sees a similar fate for David as that of Saul, which is that David will forevermore live with the guilt of spilling blood foolishly over foolish reasons and directly disobeying God by taking his own vengeance. And so Abigail is saving David from himself. And what's remarkable in the story is he sees it too. So he responds and says, yes, you're right. It would not be right for me to head down that path. There's something really gospel-ish about this story. Jonathan Tran summarizes the good news of Jesus as a story in which God saves us despite us. Or I might say the gospel is a story in which God saves us from ourselves. God intervened in history. Jesus came to save us from ourselves, and the way he did it was so important to help us continue to save us from ourselves. Jesus didn't defeat sin by killing sinners. He defeated it by confronting it, by trusting that God's power of love and life was more powerful than sin and death. That's how we are saved, and that's how we are to live. So if we put ourselves in the place of David, in our moments of being hurt or offended, we are most tempted to make things right by hitting back, by attacking those who hurt us. So in our pursuit of justice, Tran says that we attempt to install violently what God achieved peaceably. Through force and violence, we attempt to create rightness and justice in the world. But God did that already, and he did it peaceably and peacefully through self-sacrifice. So Christian peacemaking creatively looks beyond our own sense of justice towards a bigger picture of wholeness for all. Christian peacemaking generously offers people what they need, not necessarily what they deserve. Christian peacemaking is a man by the name of Preacher Peter, who lived in Switzerland in the 1700s, who woke up to the sounds of men on his roof in the middle of the night stealing the thatch off of his roof. Preacher Peter quickly woke up his wife and said, "Let's make a meal for these men in the middle of the night and invite them in." So Preacher Peter walked outside after the meal had been warmed and called up to the men, who were shocked to have been caught in the act. He invited them down for an impromptu meal because they must be hungry after all the work that they've been doing. The men came in, they sat shocked while Preacher Peter and his wife ate their meal, too scared and confused to even eat or to know what to do. As soon as the meal was done, they left the house, they went back on the roof, and they put all the thatch back in place. Christian peacemaking is Bonnie, a mission worker in Canada who was in Saskatchewan helping to plant community gardens and taking youth to trips and church activities. One morning she realized that gas had been stolen out of the tank of her car, had been siphoned out. And this continued to happen. So after another time, she tried putting a lock on the door to the gas tank, and it didn't work. It was broken into the next night. The gas was gone again. One night she slept overnight in her car, and the thieves were still brazen enough to come and siphon the gas out of her car. After 10 times of having the gas stolen out of her car, the local police and some neighbors decided the best way to resolve this was to set a trap for the thieves, and so to install a small reservoir under the car and have the gas siphon pull out gas mixed with sugar that was in this other reservoir, so that the thieves then would end up ruining their own vehicle. So they got this all set in place, and Bonnie went to bed that night. And after a couple hours of restlessness, she realized she wouldn't be able to sleep if she knew this was what was going to happen. She knew it wasn't right to simply take vengeance or to take revenge on those who had stolen her gas. So she got up, she disconnected the line that went to the tainted gas reservoir, and she taped a $10 bill and a note onto the gas cap. And the note read, "If you need the gas that badly, take the money. If you don't have enough money, come see me. I'll see if I can find a job for you. I need the gas to do my gardening and to take youth on trips." The next morning, the money, the note, and the gas were all still in her car. And it stayed that way for the rest of her time of service. Christian peacemaking is about breaking through the usual human understandings of justice, which emphasizes who is right and who is wrong, and everyone gets what they deserve. Christian peacemaking is about breaking through that, to figure out what people need, and to give generously. Christian peacemaking is about creatively and boldly responding to harm and violence with wisdom and generosity. May we figure out how to practice this in our own lives as we receive and witness harm and offense and violence in big and small situations all around us. May we follow the example of Abigail. May we follow the example of Jesus. May we be peacemakers in this world, today and all the days to come. Amen.